Hello and welcome to today's One Voice webinar on COVID-19. This is Caitlin Sickles with the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell, and I am joined today by my colleague Paul Nathanson, also at Bracewell, as well as Omar Nashashibi from the Franklin Partnership, and John Guzik will be here shortly. He's got a family matter, not an emergency, but a family matter he's dealing with right now, but he will hopefully be here in the next few moments. Today, everybody, is our 21st webinar addressing the COVID-19 issue. And as you know, the guys on the ground with the Franklin Partnership are always here with the latest updates. They'll tell you what you can expect. And of course, leading into the holiday season before Congress heads home, there will be much to report. If you are looking for a recording of this webinar and the slides, you can find them at onevoiceinfo.org. You can also find all of our previous webinars there, all the 20 previous ones offered by this team, as well as a few offered by other experts. You can find them on the webinar page of that website, so look for that there. And if you are looking to hear from more of us, you can listen every other week to the Talking with One Voice podcast, and that's where you will get other industry information and other latest breaking news. In fact, you should expect one more episode of Talking with One Voice before the holidays, where I'm sure Omar and John will bring the latest on COVID-19 debate and discussion, even more latest than what you hear today. So thank you for tuning in and for sticking with us through all of this. And I will turn it over now to Omar, who will give you the latest from here in Washington.
Thank you, Caitlin. I appreciate that. Just give you a quick overview of what we'll be looking at today. A number of CDC items coming out with regards to quarantines and ventilation FAQs for buildings. And then just stepping back, since we haven't done a COVID webinar here in a few weeks, wanted to just revisit some of the other directives that we've gotten over back in November with regards to face coverings, and just touch briefly on that. And then really try to bring folks up to speed on where we are with the PPP program, and then what we believe most of you are interested in, where we might or might not be with regards to Congress and potentially additional COVID relief bill. And that literally changes by the moment as I'm staring at my email while doing this to make sure we don't miss any updates coming from the Hill staff on that, as we're hoping for some developments today. So quickly, as we'll go ahead and get started, let me just run through the latest that we've got. Some of this you all have seen in the media with regards to CDC guidance that had been receiving pressure to shorten the amount of time to quarantine from 14 days. We had heard a lot of back and forth, especially from employers. Do they have to go through the full 14-day? What would trigger that? Here, what they're doing is they're clarifying that according to the CDC, that you do have the option to reduce the quarantine to 10 days and without testing, and even after 7 days receiving a negative test. And then, so they've got a couple of areas where they've got in here. Now, while you want to take a look at starting with the bottom here, CDC continues to endorse quarantine for 14 days. So you notice how they're hedging their bets, and there's a little caveat here. And then you jump back to the top, where they really are deferring to your local public health authorities that make the final decisions about how long quarantines should last. So there's two things to take away that we'd suggest from this slide. One would be recognizing that you may now have the option to do a shorter term quarantine for an employee or yourself based on these certain circumstances that might be met here based on CDC. You still need to be aware that there are local guidelines that would still preempt what the CD is saying. So as we've said, I think maybe over the summer, when in doubt and you have two conflicting regulations, tend to go with what you believe is the stricter and quote safer of those two regulations, and that will probably keep you tightest. Again, we can't give you legal labor advice, but this just one from here, because since we know it's been in the media quite a bit, wanted to put that and flag it for you that yes, they are saying that you can shorten, don't have to do full 14, but be aware of some of the state and local requirements that remain in place. They did also recently, just a few days ago, issue new building ventilation FAQs. Just before Halloween, we started to see an increase of different guidance and recommendations from CDC with regards to indoor operations in the business community. Obviously, we saw about social gatherings, but in this instance, they've really been focusing increasingly about manufacturing plants and elsewhere that do now have to start closing the doors and the windows in some of the hotter months, those that do have some places that are open. What this is, and obviously we didn't put it down here, but it's pretty comprehensive FAQ. If you were to check on any of these drop downs here, many of them are 2 and 3 and 4 paragraphs long. So we definitely encourage you to take a look at that one. And then also, in case you are having any vendors that are coming to you and starting to say that their certain HVAC system and new ventilations will protect against COVID-19, make sure that you can tell that they are, make sure you could click on that link below where it says, how can I tell if they are working as advertised? So the CDC is very aware that there are some additional technologies that are available, but we do want to be very careful in what's out there. We do know some groups that have started to look at different HVAC ventilation systems. Obviously, you've heard about it in restaurants, but increasingly we want to see, here are some options. So we do suggest make sure that you do send this over to your HR folks and your safety folks, and they can click on these links here, and you'll find access to this there on the bottom right-hand corner.
Yeah, and Omar, this is Paul. Bracewell happens to represent AHRI, and Caitlin does a lot of work for them. And Caitlin, AHRI has some resources too that we can share on our COVID page for One Voice.
Yeah. For sure. HRI has a study out that has 5 tips for making, they've done 2 actually, a school and workplace safer from an air ventilation perspective. So I think it's a helpful resource, and it's a very short and digestible document. So I'm happy to share that.
I think that's really critical, and thank you for bringing that up and jumping in, because as we look at recently, you have President-elect Biden has put out his 4-point plan on COVID priorities day 1, and included within that are a number of OSHA requirements that he looks to set in place for that workplace. And as we look at those, increasingly, they are going to be exploring what some of the workplace scenarios, in terms of the administrative controls, and not just the PPE that's in there, and some of the other engineering controls rather that have been put in place. And I think that increasingly understanding what some of those HVAC options will help. It's honestly one of the bullets that the Biden team has put out is going to double the number of OSHA inspectors. So you should certainly recognize that any tools that you have at your disposal on how you can address and preemptively get out ahead of this, we would suggest exploring those options as well. We could just rewind a little bit back into November, since we haven't covered this. And if those of you that haven't, if not, we'll post it on that onevoice.info website as well. But we did continue to put together slide decks in November as well, even if we didn't do live webinars. Our November slide deck did include a number of slides in there with regards to cloth face coverings. Around November 18th or so, you started to see OSHA and CDC put out different guidance with regards to whether or not a cloth face covering is PPE, and whether or not it would protect the individual wearer and the other people around them from coronavirus. So as you can take a look, this will start with CDC. The next slide will talk about how OSHA treats it for the purposes of a workplace. But right here, they talk about multi-layer cloth masks can block the release of exhaled respiratory particles in the environment. And they also go further in this latest study to say that they can block smaller particles than initially thought. Multi-layers are even more effective. Again, you have to keep in mind that this is now coming from the CDC, and where they are looking at it in terms of thread counts. Now, if you obviously have access to N95s or surgical masks, then the guidance is typically say go with those, and then you go back down towards cloth masks. So this is what the CDC tells you. And again, we're starting to see, are they being more flexible on the 14-day down to 10, more flexible on cloth face coverings? Just because one department or agency tells you something, you have to check and make sure that you're in compliance with every other part of the federal government, because one hand isn't always coordinating with the other. As you can see, cloth face coverings are not PPE. Many of you are aware of this. If you're looking back on November 18th now, this is the OSHA has put out the press release. If you go down and link on the press release and then you hit the FAQ, then you'll be able to go and see the actual language, the binding language that OSHA put in there with regards to this new standard. So just to clarify, when you're out there, it does not act as active PPE, not just for a medical environment, but also for your traditional pre-COVID and post PPE protection that you would normally have in a traditional work environment. And also please keep in mind, if your shop is using a lot of cloth face mask coverings, that you still need to keep in mind, any other particles or debris that might be attached to that in the workplace as well. And OSHA months ago has put out additional guidance with regards to how to keep face cloth clean, CDC has as well. But again, OSHA still then trying to reach that balance line, still did say it does recommend face coverings, but again, keep in mind, they're not PPE, and then look for hazard exceptions. So these hazards are typically ones that you all would know better than us. Again, if a contaminated chemical could cling to it, causing workers to inhale the chemicals at a rate that is not previously accepted, these are the things that you need to take a look at. More likely in our industries, you have to keep in mind that maybe some of the face cloths, if they're using a bandana, doesn't dangle down, it could potentially get caught up in a machinery, but most of you all already have those kinds of protocols in place by now. Again, little update here on where we are on face coverings from CDC and OSHA. And we thought this was helpful. The weekend, I think a Friday before Thanksgiving, OSHA put this out that evening, that afternoon, with regards to their most frequently cited COVID violations. We know both NTMA and PMA have been sending out some great information to their members from attorneys with whom they have partnerships. But yes, we're definitely hearing the inspections are increasing. They're definitely looking at PPE. They're looking at respiratory. They're also increasingly looking at record keeping. We've always been telling you about that, and we hear that is moving up on their priority list. They want to look at the incidents, the recordables, and part of that is tracing, but other is also to make sure that they can come in and do that quick audit. And again, this is now under President Trump. We're just going to assume that it's going to increase the inspections and the scrutiny under President-elect Biden when he comes in, just because they've already told us that. So as you can see here, these are the top ones that the OSHA is citing that are specific to COVID violations. Again, appropriate respirator, PPE. Some of these are a little bit more related to the medical industry and the healthcare professionals, but please keep track of these. I really do think the required record keeping at the bottom is the one where most of our members are going to get hung up on, and especially if they're going to double the number of inspectors, that's where we definitely are to get concerned, Paul, that they may not have the right training, they may not know what they're doing when they come in.
Yeah, and Omar, just heads up that our labor lawyers are going to put out an alert early next week on what to expect from OSHA in a Biden administration. I'll be sure to share that with everybody. And I think that a lot of you have heard my colleague Bob Nichols, who's our OSHA lawyer down in Houston, has presented to the group a couple times and is always willing to answer questions and things. So we have that resource available.
Paul, while we have you, we can pause for a minute and jump back to vaccination, since obviously the FDA, that's quite a bit, and neither you nor me or Caitlin are attorneys, so we're not going to give legal advice. But just top of your mind with regards to employer requirement for vaccinations, do you believe your law firm or others will be putting something out like that, or have they already?
Definitely, we'll be putting something out. And I think probably we will want to organize something maybe just for this group, but we'll be putting something out about what employee rights are and employee and employer rights are on that subject. So yes, thanks for bringing that up.
Okay, thank you. And so to everyone, let's start keeping in mind what strategies may be out there, especially with some sensitivities with some folks with regards to vaccinations. And then we also have to keep in mind the process by which the vaccinations will happen based on what we've been seeing from government documents. Keep in mind, it's 2 shots. You get 1 shot, 30 days later, you get your second. You wait 1 week for side effects, and then they give you the green light based on documents that we've read. Shifting over to the IRS as we transition more into the PPP and the relief efforts. A quick reminder, as we're getting to the end of the year, some of you might have had employees that were on unemployment at a certain point in time. We sent a similar reminder in a webinar back in July. The IRS just put this out as well. Just make their life easier and yours after the fact. And if you are aware you had an employee that was on unemployment at some point in the calendar year since COVID began, make sure that they've received their Form 1099-G, showing the amount that they were paid in any federal income tax elected to have withheld, or if they did the flat 10% withholding down there. Again, not trying to add one more things to the HR folks in accounting, but probably help out your employee and yourself later on. Similar, just a heads up, they are expecting delays on Form 7200 payments. Back in April, we discussed that it might have been end of March, the IRS allowed you, based on the CARES Act, to go ahead and claim in advance on some of the employee retention credits and some of the paid sick leave credits that employers were effectively refunded or reimbursed rather, for what they are saying is expect some delays in any payments and refunds coming out for 7,200 and year-end close. They in fact seem to be saying they're going to more or less shut down the process until January 21st. That's a day after January 20th. But so that's just for planning purposes. Please pass that along to your CFO if you're not on here right now, that you are going to expect to see some delays if you have filed your 7,200. If you do not know what a Form 7,200 is, please definitely talk to somebody, since if you did have some paid sick leave claims, there's potentially some tax dollars that you left on the table there. So reach out to your CPA with regards to potential benefits that were included in the FFCRA. Couple of slides here quickly on the deduction of PPP expenses, as now we'll transition into the Paycheck Protection Program of our presentation. Quick, a little bit of background. This is the issue that John and myself have gotten more emails about than any other issue on PPP since the program, or really since the summertime. The IRS back in April said that you may not deduct as expenses any Paycheck Protection Program funds that have been forgiven by the SBA. They went further in November and issued 2 additional guidance documents that I'll show you in a moment, where they said that even if you expect to have your PPP forgiven, but you have not had your loan forgiven in calendar 2020, you still may not deduct your expenses on your taxes. Now, this effectively amounts to a some cases, a 37% tax increase or a cut from your PPP funds of 37%. So it hit a lot of companies by surprise. This was not congressional intent. The Trump administration and IRS, especially in Mnuchin, have said, no, we oppose, we do not want to reverse this. And so they've been pretty strong. As you can see here, since the businesses are not taxed on the proceeds of a forgiven PPP loan, the expenses, such as those expenses for wages, utilities, rent, etc., those are not permitted to be deductible as you normally would deduct them. Again, that's not in line with congressional intent. The IRS says it's a double dip. Furthermore, in the notices that they've just put out, if you reasonably believe that your loan will be forgiven in the future, then you may not deduct those expenses. We heard some people are trying to game the system and said, technically it's still a loan, I haven't had it forgiven, so I can deduct the expenses back on September 15th, December 15th, and so on and so on. However, they did create some safe harbor. So if you did have expectations for the loan to be forgiven and it was not, then you are able to go back and have that loan and have that deduction approved and claimed. Based on tax practitioners that we're speaking to, if there was any year to file for an extension, this is the year. And increasingly, when we talk about the legislation in a few slides, you'll get a sense of what we're talking about in terms of that uncertainty. Here's the actual language for some of you that do want to pass it along to the CPA with regards to the safe harbor, that, for example, if later on you find out you are not forgiven, that you do have the ability to go back. But again, all of this assumes that we're not able to correct this in legislation here in the coming weeks, and that is and remains our top priority in lobbying for both NTMA and PMA when it comes to the PPP part of COVID relief. A quick summary again that you all can take it back with you. So what did the IRS do with regards to the deduction of PPP expenses? Again, it reaffirmed its position back in April under Notice 2020-32 that a borrower receiving loan forgiveness may not deduct those eligible PPP expenses. Furthermore, they clarified again that if you expect to have it forgiven, you may not deduct, but you do have some form of a safe harbor that's in there. So the bottom line is here, talk about doing an extension, and let's hope we get some of our lobbying efforts up on that as well. And I think my colleague John just joined us as well, and we'll start transitioning right now over into filing of comments with regards to the PPP here. And let me set this up and I'll turn it over to John here, especially when we get to legislation. But what happened a few months, or last month rather, the Small Business Administration, John and I started getting emails from staff around the Hill and around town that SBA has been sending questionnaires to PPP loan recipients of $2 million or more. And we're saying that you need to effectively justify the need that you had for this form, or for requesting this loan and having it forgiven. Again, in our November slide deck, we sent out the actual forms that are out there. And finally, we actually did see SBA I think just this week, finally post on their website the Form 3509 and Form 3510, neither of which were actually publicly available anywhere. It was just John and I got it through our sources where it required businesses to justify and say, what were your non-COVID capital expenditures for this year? What were some of your dividend payouts for this year? And a number of other financial information that were clearly after the fact and aimed at moving the goalposts. So what we did, One Voice did file comments opposing the SBA needs test that they've created after the fact. We did sign on with some other coalitions and colleagues in an effort to oppose this as well. But as you can see, we also did just day before yesterday on Wednesday evening, get an additional FAQ update on 3509. So if you recall, there's a number of forms. You have 3508, 3508S, and 3508EZ. And those will be for the different loan sizes that are out there. This is one more they created in that series of 3509 or for for-profit borrowers. This is for $2 million or more. As of now, we're hearing it's only for $2 million or more, but at any time, obviously, that could change. Keep in mind, you do have a new administration coming in that is well within their legal rights to again move the goalposts and potentially change the rules on you. And with regards to oversight, I think John and I would agree that's something we possibly expect. So with regards to the FAQ right here, what it says is just because you're receiving this questionnaire does not mean that they're challenging the certification that you made that you actually needed the loan for your continuing operation to prevent disruption. But they are going to assess, however, whether the borrower did have adequate basis for making that required good faith certification and look at the circumstances prior to and after the borrower's certification that they made at the time they requested the loan. So how do you look at this? Now, there's a number of things that they also did at the same time. They have laid out a further process for an appeal that you can now move through if in fact they come through and challenge. So in the last 10 days or so, if you go onto the SBA's PPP website, focus more on the information for lenders, not for borrowers, and you'll actually find in there a number of additional documents that are buried in. Again, mostly for the over 2 million, which is why we put it in here, though. We do believe potentially that it could drift down further into other areas. And one last slide, the next one here, we'll jump over to legislative language, but just wanted to let you all know with regards to PPP forgiveness applications, when to apply, who's applied, and where the status currently lies for that. Right now, we currently, it's a little bit old, but this is the most recent data that they've released so far. Yes, the date's up in the corner, November 22nd. As of November 22nd, we're looking at total submissions, just under 600,000 applications have been filed for forgiveness, and you're looking at the total payouts of 367,000. Now, our recommendation still has been and maintains to wait if you can. We recognize there are a number of loan terms and other covenants you might have in place that preclude you from having a loan of this size still on the books for much longer, but you're not going to get your loan forgiven by December 31st. Most of you have a loan well over 150,000, and logistically, it's not going to happen. So we don't see much benefit to turning around and filing, say, this afternoon, when on the next slide, John's going to jump in and start talking about some of the COVID relief bill legislative changes that potentially are coming. And so you'll get a better sense of, if we do get a bill, why we've recommended waiting. But as you can see, they are being processed. We have heard from one company that was under 150,000. They did get something processed in 1 week's time, but the majority are still taking 60 and possibly up to 90 days. But there is a system. Again, not all banks are accepting them. We definitely are seeing, don't want to say a third of the banks, but a number of banks still are not accepting applications for forgiveness. They are still waiting on additional guidance and more changes from Capitol Hill. But John, that's really what we're looking at. The COVID relief bill, where do you think we stand with regards to how negotiations look right now?
And notice the word is now relief. We're no longer using the word stimulus. But before we go there, I do want to point out there was a Senate Small Business Committee hearing this past week, and this SBA needs test issue was of high importance on a bipartisan level. Republicans and Democrats on the committee were not happy with the SBA. Unfortunately, SBA was not testifying. They had other people testifying who have been in and out of government and who have benefited from the PPP loan. So I do believe there's going to be additional scrutiny on this SBA needs test. But to Omar's original point, there is a bipartisan, bicameral proposal to provide relief, budget relief, and they're trying to attach it to the year-end spending bill, which is set to expire on December 18th, which is next Friday. So Pelosi, Biden, Schumer, they have agreed with the $908 billion relief package. McConnell is still looking at trying to get something more targeted, but the two issues that we've been talking about for months now, remain the same. The two sticking points, that is funding for state and local governments is a problem to the GOP, and then the liability protections is a concern for many of the Democrats moving forward. As we've mentioned in the past, PPP maintains strong support in this $908 billion package. We'll talk about a little more about that later, but we do expect, and this package does include the deductibility of expenses that Omar probably talked about earlier, and we do anticipate an expansion of PPP for proper use of the PPP loan for facilities for PPE, personal protective equipment and such, but we also see the likelihood of allowing the employee retention tax credit. Those who receive the PPP loan would not be, currently are not eligible for the employee retention tax credit, and we believe that change will be made moving forward on, in this package. So when you look at what that framework is, right now the PPP loan in the $908 billion proposal is $300 billion of that goes for PPP. There is a second draw, but it's limited to employers with under 300 employees. And if you can demonstrate a 30% revenue loss in any quarter of 2000. So remember that, under 300 employees and a 30% revenue loss. Now, based on our polling information, that is a good number. It originally started at 50, it went down to 30. We were successful in encouraging Senator Rubio to get it down to 35. And right now in this bipartisan, bicameral proposal, it has the revenue loss at 30%, which, it doesn't capture all of our One Voice members, but it does capture a pretty good amount of that. Other good news in the PPP, 501c6s, lobbying firms. Unfortunately, our lobbying firm is not eligible for a second draw in the PPP, but 501c6s are, with under 150 employees, are eligible for a PPP loan. As I said, allow the deductibility, and so that is the framework right now on the PPP loan.
Right, and as you look at this, let's keep in mind that much of this is just a proposal, right? So we are still a ways away. In a few slides, and John, I'll get a little bit more of where we think we might be. But as we're coming up here, almost on the half hour, a couple other things that we want to point out. We did in a recent survey identify that of our combined NTMA and PMA members, about 10% were taking some kind of an SBA loan that was not PPP, meaning a 7A or a 504 or maybe even an 8A loan. 7As in here. So take a look at some of the language. Some of you might have been participating in an SBA loan where you had your principal payments that were delayed, I think until September 27th, I want to say the date was. So this proposal does look to extend for SBA loans for section 112, for section 112. So take a look at that. If we do get this through, I think that would be beneficial for a number of our members that are out there. Unemployment assistance, that's where we take a look at what they might end up considering here. Again, this is now still coming from that bipartisan group. We're not entirely sure what they're going to end up and how they end up going from there. But right now, this ends up at federal supplemental unemployment insurance benefits expanded by $300 per week for 16 weeks. John, you can touch on in a minute here what it looks like with McConnell and some of the holds up. But, I just hate to get too far down the path with this $908 billion proposal that is, yes, bipartisan, when traditionally leadership is the one that drives the train on this. McConnell's not going to let the inmates run the asylum. So typically whatever deal we do end up seeing, while it might include some of these components, they ultimately is going to have to come out of whatever McConnell wants. Don't you think, John? Because right now, as you pointed out, the federal government runs out of funding. Well, assuming they don't, let's assume, John, they pass this bill today, right? Our government's supposed to shut down, folks, tonight at 12:01 a.m., switching in tomorrow. So assuming government can give us another week, the plan there is to attach this COVID relief bill of some sorts to the final spending bill and move that forward. But John, what do you, yesterday was not a positive day for those of us lobbying for action.
Yeah, two significant things happened late this week. One, McConnell said to Biden and Pelosi and Schumer, look, let's pass what we can and set aside what we can't. And so McConnell's proposal was, let's pass what we want, what we can, and not pass state and local funding. And we won't pass the liability protection, which is the line in the sand for McConnell. Well, needless to say, Schumer and Pelosi did not like that idea. Then the White House came to the table on Wednesday with not a $908 billion proposal, but a $916 billion proposal, which basically would call for $600 direct payments to taxpayers versus the $1,200 that was done earlier. A $600 direct payments to individuals, but it eliminated the unemployment, enhanced unemployment. Needless to say, that was not, in a bipartisan way, it was not received very well in these negotiations. The bottom line is, to Omar's point, the leadership in the past are the ones who negotiate these deals. It's not the kids in the asylum. And at this point, because of the election, it's no longer the administration moving forward. When hearing after hearing that we participate in, when there's an administration official and then there's somebody else, the focus has been on that somebody else, whether it's the Federal Reserve or different agencies moving forward. So it's not so much the White House. And having the White House involved in these discussions at this point is going to make it even more difficult for us to get the deductibility of expenses, which we have had such bipartisan support in the Congress from the leadership, but of course not from the White House. President, clearly.
Sorry, on that point, John, that's a really good point, because just to let you all know where we stand, because if you haven't done so already, there is an action alert that's been posted at metalworkingadvocate.org. You can click on the top at Take Action and send a letter to your representatives and senators calling for them to take action on the deduction of expenses and overturning the IRS ruling on that and additional plans. Because where we stand on it right now, we have it in the bipartisan bicameral bill. We've had it in the House Democrats bill. It's just not right now in the White House or the McConnell bill. So we've got 3 out of the 4 major players on the Capitol Hill that we need, but we're getting, it's going to be close with regards to that. Sorry, John.
No, and so what does this all mean? We're still optimistic that they will an agreement before the end of the year, because therefore it's not going to, a stimulus bill will not come together until late February and late March. And so we're going to be doing this all over again with those same issues of state and local government and liability protections and all. And we know President Biden moving forward wants to do a larger stimulus, which is, we believe, why Pelosi and Schumer are agreeing to this $908 billion bipartisan bicameral measure, because they know President Biden, after he's sworn in, is going to move something forward. But then again, it's going to depend on several factors. One, the special elections in Georgia and the Senate may have an impact. Where's the economy in January, February, March of next year? What do those February and March jobs numbers, what are they going to look like? How those numbers turn out may impact the size of any future stimulus moving forward. But the bottom line, what we know is we're going to do this all again early next year with President-elect Biden in the White House.
Agreed, but let's look at the TikTok of the next few hours. Those of you that are still looking at some COVID relief or some changes to the programs on PPP that we've discussed and have been proposed, where are we looking? So right now we're at 12:31 exactly Eastern on Friday. If we are going to get a vote by next Friday, here's what would need to happen. You'd probably need to see legislative language no later than late afternoon on Monday. The House Rules Committee would have to move forward on Monday night. The House would likely have to vote on Tuesday evening, sending it over to the Senate. There will be an objection, which means 30 hours of debate will have to be eaten up, all full 30 hours, and then they'd move forward with possibly a vote on Friday morning with, again, government spending, meaning lights out for the government at 11:59. Well, that's when it shuts down, ends 11:59 p.m. next Friday. That's in a perfect world. We do not live in a perfect world right now, and few of us at this point are expecting that. We might even be looking at another extension beyond December 18th into and around Christmas. I mean, we've been in the Speaker suite lobbying Pelosi on net operating loss literally the Friday before Christmas before, so it's not unheard of for this to continue. But keep in mind, we are still optimistic, not as optimistic as we were on Tuesday of this week of something moving, but let's see where we end up on the weekend. They are very, very far apart. Republicans, John, they still oppose state and local funding. And then we still have a problem with liability protection, on which we are still lobbying for businesses. So we're still a ways away. So just let's see where we are. We'll look for notices from us early next week on where status might be. But Paul, Caitlin, we'll turn it over to you for a little bit, since we know the media have been talking to you.
Yeah, just changing the subject a little bit. While you have all these challenges, I know, confronting you regarding the pandemic, there has been a lot of interest in the media too regarding the rising price and of steel and the availability of steel. Interest in the media. We've gotten several requests, and I've connected some of you with reporters already to talk about the supply situation, particularly with, there was ATI getting out of the stainless market and things like that. Obviously, we are advocating for the removal of the Section 232 steel tariffs, hopefully early in a Biden administration. It's to be determined. He just announced his nominee for USTR. So over the next few weeks, that will all be the organized effort to convince them to lift the tariffs will begin in earnest. But if you do have steel supply issues and you're interested in talking to the media, please let us know. There's also a great deal of interest in another aspect, and that even with this rising unemployment, there's still a big problem finding workers and the challenges that the pandemic is creating. So there's media interest in that story as well. Thanks, Omar.
Thank you. As always, please, any support you can do for your associations that's been supporting you throughout this process. We've got a couple questions here to answer on PPP, but obviously it's been a challenging year for everybody all around, and hopefully you found these webinars valuable. You can click here. Anything with a corporate credit card would be appreciated. We can continue to provide these webinars as we look into potentially the series continuing, unfortunately, frankly, into next year, as we're not seeing an end in sight quite yet in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, we do want to thank many of you who are on this call, on this webinar, have already generously given, and we want to say thank you to those. But for those who haven't yet, making that contribution will be really important. We're going to have at least one more. We're probably going to have one more webinar this year once the Congress finally adjourns and we find out what they passed or what they didn't pass. But as Omar said, we're most likely than not going to continue these webinars in the next year, because many of these same issues are not going away anytime soon.
All right, so we look forward to continuing this series, but we'll keep people posted next week of what we see happening in development. We'll definitely be recording at least one podcast here before the end of the year and try to keep people updated. Let's go with a couple of questions that we've received. First one, is the new PPP proposal for 300 or fewer employees in the US or as a global headcount? We believe that the affiliation rules will still apply. Obviously, we don't know since it's still in proposal, as the questioner pointed out, but we don't have any reason to believe that the SBA affiliation rules that would want you to combine not just your overseas, but also your affiliates domestically as well. In fact, we do know that the intent of the legislation is to also look at your franchisees and others that you may be affiliated with here in the United States. Please keep in mind, as you look at the second draw, as the questioner rightly pointed out, there will be restrictions, not just the 30% loss test that I'll address in a second, but also the 300 headcount. This is not like first draw PPP, where some of our automotive stampers in particular, who have up to 1,000 employees, were considered small businesses for purposes of the PPP loan. It's not by NAICS codes. There is not an or in the legislative language proposal as drafted. It's an and, so you would have to meet the 300 or fewer headcount. And again, we suspect it would include global and domestic affiliates. And then you'd also have to meet the 30% revenue drop. That's the second question that we've received here. Here's the question. How is the 30% revenue drop calculated? Current quarter versus prior quarter, or current quarter versus same quarter last year? What they've done is they're doing the same quarter, apples to apples. So let's say second quarter 2020 compared to second quarter of 2019. That is the intent for what they'll do on second draw and for the employee retention credit. What John said is tax credit. What John said is correct. We were successful in getting down that threshold from 50% down to 30%. We were hoping for 25. Honestly, we're not done yet. We're not actually happy with the quarter. We were shooting for an 8-week term. So that way, because a lot of our manufacturers did not meet a full quarter of loss, especially as they straddled some of this Q2, Q3, when we saw some pickup back in the summer again. And so for that reason, we've been lobbying for an 8-week term that you could compare anytime in 2020, 8 weeks with the exact 8 weeks in 2019. We did have the support of Small Business Committee Chairman Marco Rubio on that as of August, but we'll see where we end up in negotiations. So that's what we know as of right now. For that second question, it'll be comparing the same quarters for 2019 and for 2020. The next question we received, is there a deadline for forgiveness applications for PPP loans? And if so, what is it? Do you think the deadline will change if new COVID legislation is passed and signed into law? We believe that they're going to maintain with the current language that they've got, which is that you have 10 months from the end of your covered period to seek forgiveness. We don't think you should wait for that full term as we see some changes coming in, but you look at the end of that covered period is really where you want to start that clock. And so you do have some time that we want to take a look at, and not just the end of the covered period, but when you also are starting to submit your application, because you've got some processes to continue to work through. We would suggest, strongly suggest, work with your lenders now, even if you don't plan on submitting in calendar 2020. Start working with them and getting some of that paperwork together, because you don't know what's going to happen here coming in 2021. And again, you also don't know what Joe Biden's going to change. Again, they're fully within their rights to issue new rounds of regulations that could make some tweaks. Keep in mind, most of PPP was actually implemented through these interim final rules that were out there. Another question we received: do you think the FFCRA is going to be extended? If so, when do you think the extension will be approved? And that's an excellent question with regard to some of the provisions that we mentioned in there with regards to unemployment insurance and some of the other even CARES Act support. What we're hearing is sort of a mixed message on it. If this was a few months ago, we would have told you that we were expecting a clean December 31st extension to July 31 for the most part, to just simply extend many of these FFCRA requirements and provide additional number of hours. As we know, the 80 hours are just coming up. But increasingly, we've started to pick up that they want to do a bridge more into March. Now, whether or not they actually extend some of these tax provisions and some of the benefits and some of the accrued hours fully, that we're hoping to get a better sense of over the weekend as we get to see some legislative language. But the reason they want to go into March is that forces Democrats, or forces Republicans in the mind of Democrats, to move another bill. So if you wait too long into the summertime, there's no sense of urgency to move that stimulus bill that John was describing that Biden so badly wants. So any extensions as of now that we're expecting most likely would be to March 31st and not fully to July 31st or to the end of next year. Again, some speculation until we get that language, hopefully early next week. With that, we're already at 12:42. If there aren't any questions, feel free, please, to reach out to your teams in Ohio for both NTMA and PMA, or to John or myself or Paul or Caitlin, and we will certainly keep you updated. This is a critical next 3 days or so. As we get more developments coming from Capitol Hill, we will be sure to keep you all up to date. On behalf of all of us, thank you again for everything, and we'll stay in touch.
Thank you.
Bye.